Hello and welcome to the Reorg, where we dive into the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute archives and re-examine old ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. This is your host, Michael Goldstein, also known as Bitstein, and joining me is my co-host, Pierre Rochard. Pierre, how are you today?
Very well. Thank you, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing especially well, as I realize we're reading one of my favorites today. So
Yeah, this is a classic.
This makes it an extra special day. So we have been going through, for maybe some of the new listeners, we've been going through the SNI mempool crash course in Bitcoin political economy, which was a collection of articles from about 2013 to 2015 that laid out our early vision about why Bitcoin would overtake fiat and precious metals to become the world reserve currency. And we've been working our way through that. And, we started with kind of the basic monetary policy of Bitcoin. We went through the sort of the proof of work and the things that kind of gave it its first value on the market. And then we looked at Bitcoin from a sort of bubble perspective of, this thing is growing and in these crazy hype cycles, but, does that mean that we can continue to expect that? And of course, our answer was a resounding yes. And now, given that fact, we're trying to look more into what that means from the sort of individual hodler perspective and how that then reflects onto these broader Bitcoin trends. So in this section, it says, given expected growth, people have reason to hoard Bitcoins. This increases the value of the network, giving more reason to hoard. Hoarders can also increase the value of their holdings by investing in open source development that makes the network more valuable as a whole. And we're gonna start with just the straight case for hoarding, and we are reading today the very classic "I'm hoarding Bitcoins and no, you can't have any" by Daniel Krawisz. This came out on February 12th, 2014. The price then was about $654. So the people who did hoard since then have been quite happy, and some of them might even be at a point now where they feel like Scrooge McDuck here. This article, remains timeless. This comes up as probably one of the most common kind of talking points for us is the focus on Bitcoin as savings. And there's just so many different ways that people try to make sense of Bitcoin or make sense of why Bitcoin is not meeting their expectations. And so much of it comes down to this exact topic. So I think it's such an important one, and I look forward to getting into it. Pierre, do you have any preliminary thoughts before this?
Yeah, so you mentioned the Bitcoin price was $650, and it can feel like, oh wow, now that we're, let's say, 80,000, well, aren't all the gains behind us? And the truth is that I think that us reading it today, so let's say 11 years later, when we read this again in 11 years, so in the year 2036, we will have the same reaction of last time I read this, the Bitcoin price is $80,000. Now it's $8 million, and let's dive into it. So,
can you believe what the Reorg guys were saying?
Yeah,
when it was a mere $85,000.
Yeah. So, and the reason why I have tremendous conviction on this bold assertion is how many people have not read this article or don't understand it or are viscerally opposed to it. I think that we're still very early.
Yes. So one last preliminary thing that I'll say is, a lot of these articles came out of a realization that, there's many ideas that people had in Bitcoin as to, what Bitcoin is, why it's going to grow. And a lot of these were sort of responses to different things happening in the market, trying to correct what we thought were errors. And of course, at the time, Daniel did a great job of putting pen to paper or, typing up and getting these ideas out there. And at this time, I would say in early 2013, in the early days and say 2013, which of course felt like the late days. But, at that time, for instance, the HODL meme didn't even really exist in a meaningful sense. I actually forget the exact date that the HODL, that actually may have been 2014. I can't remember specifically. It was one of those 2 years. But in any case, it was just like a very early meme, and it tended to be specifically around what was being described in the original post itself, which was sort of hodl during dips. So it's like, even though the price is going down, I'm going to continue to hodl, which, kind of gives a glimpse of the long-term hoarding mentality, but not quite as much, because in some sense it's like, well, I want to get back to spending, but I need to wait until the purchasing power gets back up a little more. You can still have that within the HODL thing. So back in 2013, I can say even myself, I was someone who anywhere I went is like, hey, do you accept Bitcoin? And at the time, people had no clue what Bitcoin even was. And there was a desire to be doing that. And, over time, I think it started to set in that just was not the right strategy for growing Bitcoin adoption. But it took not only, articles like this to be written and mulled over, but it takes some time to internalize and also see where your hopes get up because there's someone accepting Bitcoin. And then over time, it's like, actually, it wasn't really the most economically viable thing. And then it kind of fades away. And, then people say Bitcoin's dead, even though it's, continuing to grow and so on. So yeah, anyway, from that, we can go ahead and get started. But this was timely then, but as we've seen, and as we'll discuss, it remained so important today. So starting, those nasty hoarders, the ones, they won't use Bitcoins because they think they'll be worth so much more later. But how can we convince businesses to accept Bitcoins if no one will spend them? We need to guilt those hoarders into spending their Bitcoins to support the merchants. This article is about why this line of reasoning is exactly wrong. I'd like to real quick point out, just since we're introducing the term hoarding, that itself is sort of a pejorative that comes from typically a very sort of Keynesian mindset of treating holding money as a sort of drag on the economy because money needs to flow. And so if you're just sitting on a cash balance, you're not participating in the economy according to these people. And so the term hoarding, we kind of play with that fact and, celebrate Scrooge McDuck up here. But yeah, the word itself had such a pejorative context, and this article is trying to make light of that to show the economic benefits of the hoarder. So, if you sell Bitcoins, you aren't selling Bitcoins. I'm sure you've heard a story like this. I've been going to all the local stores and telling them how awesome Bitcoin is, but none of them wants to take payments in Bitcoin. Why don't they like it? Let's think about that for a minute. You are essentially telling the merchant, hey, look at this totally awesome thing that I want to get rid of. You should trade me some stuff for it. Not actually much of a sales pitch, is it? Why would the merchant want something that you apparently don't want? If you really want him to start accepting Bitcoins himself, ask him, do you take worthless paper money at this store? Good, because you're not getting a Satoshi from me. That will convince him that you think they are valuable. How about this instead? Tell your local merchants that you want to be able to spend cash in their stores and get the change in Bitcoins. That's the kind of store I'd like to shop at. And then when the merchant later says, I'm not going to do that anymore, I want you to pay me in Bitcoins, you know he's become a true hoarder. I think there's, this is a It's almost like it's just such a simple thing, and yet it makes so much sense that, yeah, if you're trying to unload it, well, what's in it for them? Hoarders give Bitcoin value. The initial price of Bitcoin was caused by people who wanted to hold it, not people who wanted to spend it. Furthermore, each subsequent step in Bitcoin's advance must begin with more holders, not more spenders. The business that Bitcoins can absorb is limited by its market cap. At a market cap of $2 or $3 billion, Bitcoin can absorb many small businesses, but it cannot be used for international oil trade. It would have to be dozens of times more expensive for that, and it can only achieve that if people's desire to hold Bitcoins continues to increase faster than their desire to spend them. Thus, one who wants Bitcoin to become mainstream should never want its price to be lower. He should want an ever-increasing supply of hoarders. It is true that Bitcoin's price can occasionally and temporarily outpace the growth in its real prospects, but this is merely a byproduct of Bitcoin's phenomenal success. A commodity which increases in price as quickly as Bitcoin's can be expected to experience shocks and manias on its way up, because it would be difficult to tell the difference between a sustainable price increase and a short-term speculation. However, does it really make sense to prefer an alternative history for Bitcoin in which its price has increased slowly enough that it never developed any manias? I do not see how that could possibly be preferable. The faster Bitcoin grows, the more complete and decisive will be its victories, and the more difficult it will be for its natural enemies to react to it. I think we've mentioned this idea before that, Bitcoin has to grow in order to be liquid enough to handle certain amounts of trade. And so, there are even certain kinds of businesses that can't even think about Bitcoin just when it's a small thing. So like he's saying here, in order for oil trade to even consider Bitcoin as a payment method, it has to be much bigger. And the only thing that someone who is in the oil trade and wants to kind of look after their self-interest well into the future, the only thing that they can actually do to help achieve that cause is to buy up Bitcoin now for the purposes of being able to engage in oil trade later, which would, as a speculative act, be helping bring Bitcoin to that expectation faster, insofar as the expectation is correct, such that they can start doing that. And I think that's important here. It was the case that early on, any sort of mom and pop store that was within the size, the small scale that Bitcoin could support, if they were able to successfully sell things for Bitcoins and then hold on to those Bitcoins, and have, the sort of treasury strategies that we talk about today, they could have done that. And anyone who did do that would be tremendously successful. But at the time, only they would have been able to do that.
Yeah, that's right. I find that last sentence really interesting of the faster Bitcoin grows, the more difficult it will be for its natural enemies to react to it, because I feel like now we've reached a point where the natural enemies of Bitcoin have essentially surrendered or are cowering in fear. They're like in a fetal position in the corner of the room because it's been Bitcoin's rise has been, metaphorically speaking, very violent, and that it's to Bitcoin's benefit from that perspective of kind of intimidating its enemies. But at the same time, I also agree with the outpacing the growth. And so if you had an asset that essentially grew by a fixed percentage every day, that doesn't work for human psychology, because then humans would say, oh, okay, well, I can just borrow dollars and invest in this asset risk-free because I know it's going to increase by a fixed percentage every day. And then when you have people start doing that, well, inevitably you get a bubble, right? As we were talking about in a previous episode, the outpacing, and then on the flip side, the underpacing, right? After the bubble bursts, Bitcoin grows more slowly, in price than it does in fundamentals. So it's kind of this oscillating pattern around Bitcoin's fundamental value that if you're not used to, and this is why Bitcoiners say zoom out, right? If you're not used to zooming out, you get caught up in the day-to-day price movements, and you think that Bitcoin's prospects are a function of yesterday's price.
Yes, and of course, the hoarder kind of benefits in both situations in that if it's outpacing the growth and the hoarder has, felt a wealth effect and is ready to, there are things that matter to him more in life than those specific sats and their future value. He has a fantastic opportunity to sell off. And then the hoarder, insofar as they have more conviction about the future of Bitcoin, when it's underperforming, there's just more chance to hoard because everyone else has kind of gotten worn out by the the whiplash of all the price change. So there's blood in the streets and cheap sats to be bought. And then and the cycle continues, so the hoarder just continues to win. Lots of winning. Who needs merchants anyway? One of the most annoying things about Bitcoin is that it's so convenient to make payments with it that sometimes it is extremely tempting to spend it and avoid the hassle of using dollars. One of the ways to help deal with the temptation to spend is to demand a Bitcoin discount at any store that accepts Bitcoin. This is perfectly reasonable because not only is the store lowering its costs by using Bitcoin, but it is asking me to give up an inherently superior commodity. Hoarders are more important than merchants. If a restaurant downtown starts accepting Bitcoins, this does not necessarily create an incentive for anybody to buy more Bitcoins. Why would anyone bother if they can still just use a credit card? If you can convince a merchant to accept Bitcoins and stop accepting dollars, then I will be impressed. Unless a merchant is offering something that cannot be bought for dollars, or at least offering a discount, he is only benefiting Bitcoin to the extent that he encourages more hoarding. If he immediately converts the Bitcoins he receives as payments into dollars, and if his customers only buy Bitcoins so as to spend them at his shop shortly thereafter, then neither has much direct effect on Bitcoin's demand. The real hero is the hoarder behind the scenes who buys from the merchant and enables him to convert his payments into dollars. I think there's a lot going on there. Kind of make our way through these, paragraph by paragraph. But, first, the idea of, a Bitcoin discount, I think that does make sense. Depending on, the purpose of the good and trying to work out the expected future value of the sats that you're giving up on it, you're probably going to, have less of a desire to give up those sats in the first place. And so you should basically be making a more, I guess, aggressive bid for the, lowball bid for the goods that you want. If they're going to expect you to give that. I know that, lately you have companies like Zapprite who are focused on the Bitcoin payment side, and they take the other side of this, which is the point of view of the merchant, where you actually, and we'll get to this, so like the merchants that actually do want to take Bitcoin seriously, they have the exact opposite feeling. And this is true of any exchange on the market. A person who is trying to buy a good wants to get that good at the lowest price possible, and a person selling a good wants to get it at the highest price possible. And so the natural consequence for someone who is trying to sell a good so they can acquire Bitcoin, they're going to want to add what Zapprite allows, which is a fiat premium. So it's like if you're gonna pay me in dollars and make me put up with the additional costs of having to deal with fiat payments in general, which is going to include credit card fees and so on and so forth, which, of course, with a Bitcoin payment, the consumer just pays the fee directly as opposed to it kind of indirectly coming through the seller. and you're going to make me have to actually go to an exchange to turn it into Bitcoins and so on and so forth, you're going to have to pay me for that. And I want more for it. And so I think those things go hand in hand. But the clear thing there is that is happening in the context of a merchant who actually wants to be hoarding Bitcoin themselves. That is a consequence of a desire to hoard more. And I think, skipping to this end where, he's talking that the real hero is the hoarder behind the scenes. If someone is just accepting Bitcoin just because it's a cool fad, and then they immediately turn around and sell the Bitcoins, they're effectively just kind of being a drag on the Bitcoin economy, because the person who wanted to buy the good, they're saying that, okay, at this given price, Bitcoin is high enough. And then the merchant is also basically saying the same thing. And so at the margin, that's lowering the purchasing power of Bitcoin and showing that there's less market demand for Bitcoin. And so considering, as we've discussed, the value of and usefulness of a monetary network is related to its purchasing price. So the higher the purchasing price, the more valuable it is. Who increases the purchasing power? It is the hoarder. And so the real hero here is the person when the merchant wants to get rid of their Bitcoins for dollars. For the buyer of the good, it's easy. They just send the sats and they get their good. But for that fiat exchange, they have to actually go find someone who has dollars willing to give them. And the only person that they're going to find is someone who has, at that price, a willingness to hoard Bitcoins they were not willing to hoard. So as I like to say, sometimes Bitcoins just need to find a better home. And I think when you have a series of trades of this kind, where the buyer doesn't want his Bitcoin anymore because he values a t-shirt more, and the t-shirt merchant doesn't want Bitcoin because they really just wanted dollars, and the Bitcoin was just sort of a marketing thing to get people to spend their sats, it's only at the end that it gets to hopefully a much better home, someone who has the hands to properly steward Bitcoin into its more valuable and more glorious future. Continuing on, greed is your friend. There can be no spending of Bitcoins without buying of them, and thus all use of Bitcoins as a medium of exchange depends on someone who wants to increase his holding, i.e. a hoarder. Without them, there could literally be no Bitcoin trade. Furthermore, it is counterproductive to try to turn hoarders into spenders. There really is no compelling reason that anybody should spend Bitcoin anytime soon. If everybody is hoarding, that will just make the price go up until finally someone can't help spending some. Currencies are unusual in that the greater is its market cap, the more useful they are. This is in contrast to a more ordinary security, such as a stock, because a stock has a better value the cheaper it is in relation to the underlying assets of the company. A more expensive currency is ipso facto a more marketable and more liquid, thus making it a superior medium of exchange. The more Bitcoin hoarding there is, the better it is as a medium of exchange. Thus, the success of Bitcoin is to some extent a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's referencing Satoshi Nakamoto talking about early people buying Bitcoin or acquiring Bitcoin. Belief in Bitcoin improves the Bitcoin network as long as people back up that belief by the action of acquiring and holding more. The more greedy people are for Bitcoin, the better are its chances. You should never want people to spend more. You should want everyone to be as greedy as possible. So this it kind of reiterates what I just said about a medium of exchange being more valuable and more useful when the purchasing power is up. So this kind of goes into like a key thing with money is in order to spend it, there has to be demand on the other side. You cannot have a payment if there is no demand to get it. And, depending on the person, you'll have different, time frames of how long they want to hold. So the merchant that we described previously, who just accepts Bitcoins and turns it into dollars, they technically, if we want to use the phrasing of store of value, what that means, and I'll continue using it here mostly because it kind of, people grok it, even though I think it's a misleading phrase. But when people say store of value, they're basically saying they are holding a medium of exchange for the purposes of some future exchange. And typically, they mean it well into the future. But you still have to have a, quote, store of value, even to accept it long enough to get it to an exchange to sell for dollars. Even if it was instantaneous, you can still say, for that flash of an instant, it was being used as a store of value between making its way to settle into your cash balance, and then from your cash balance settle into the hands of the counterparty that you're buying dollars from. And that discrete step of ending up in your cash balance, that was, for even that flash of a moment, is a store of value. However, obviously, the more you have long-term high expectations of Bitcoin, the expectation of when you're going to want to engage in actually sort of fulfill, so to speak, that future exchange with Bitcoin may be well into the future, so far in the future that you have no expectations. It's just literally, as long as I can hold it. Although, the end game of that is still, I want this on hand for the purposes of future exchange. And for that, we generally call that a store of value. Pierre, I know you've recently had arguments of this very sort. What do you think that economists like George Selgin, is there anything that I missed that you think people like him kind of miss when they are trying to analyze this topic?
Well, usually it goes back to Hoppe's the yield for money held reconsidered, right? And so as long as there's not really any kind of understanding of why people actually hold money, then everything downstream of that is going to be borked.
Yes, agreed. And that's, he's getting that's coming from Hutt. But he's also, bringing in effectively what Mises and Rothbard and everyone else said. I do think that article in particular is so very important because it's probably, I think it's really one of the best distillations of that concept that we have, and it is available to read on the Nakamoto Institute. So I will be sure to put a link in the show notes. But yes,
Well, I was just going to add that I feel like, and I've tried to dig this trench in this direction, which is that in that article, Hoppe points out the distinction between risk and uncertainty, which I think is a really important Austrian distinction, and that you hold money to hedge against uncertainty because when it comes to risk, you can hedge against that using insurance. So so if you kind of model out the evenly rotating economy, you don't need money if the whole world is just risk and there's no uncertainty. Uncertainty being something that you can't quantify. And so then if we look at Bitcoin's properties, what I think Bitcoin does is minimize uncertainty as the system in itself. So, the price is a risk, the transaction fees are a risk, but those are two things you can hedge. And then if you look at the uncertainty, how does Bitcoin as a system minimize uncertainty? Through decentralization, right? And so then it comes full circle into Bitcoin's kind of cypherpunk value proposition is actually the same as its monetary proposition. And so, if you're hedging against uncertainty, you would use the system that is the least uncertain. So yeah, that's an area where I think Austrians and let's say the cypherpunks, there needs to be a handshake there and some kind of synthesis of understanding that I've been trying to push.
Yes, I wrote an article on my Substack a long time ago, and I have people I have had people ask me to put it on the Nakamoto Institute, so maybe I should listen to the people. It's a little tough when it's your own article. It's tooting your own horn to curate it on there. But if the people demand it,
it's not you putting the article on there. It's the people that told you to put the article there.
Yes.
It's actually it's scope 2 emissions of articles.
Yes. And so the article that I'd written was sort of, a play on everyone's a scammer, but it was called Everyone's a Speculator. And it was dealing with the idea of just the term speculator because people, they bandy that about. George Selgin, for instance, constantly is saying how much of the demand for Bitcoin is effectively, speculative demand. But I mean, really, I think like that's kind of it's true. It's literally true. But also I would give it a less pejorative term because it's being used in a pejorative context, and it's more just reservation demand. And my point there is that all human action is speculative because we are dealing with the future and have to deal with the fact that the future is inherently uncertain. And this is where the Austrian distinction between kind of uncertainty and risk becomes very important. And so yeah, speculation is merely using your understanding of the world around you to try to make a decision about what actions can or shouldn't be taken in order to deal with those potential futures. And there's different types of future uncertainties. The terminology I'm mixing it up myself, but there are different types of futures that we have to deal with. One of them is effectively the natural elements. There are natural disasters. There are different amounts of rainfall that might fall that would affect how we do agriculture. There are there's winds and stuff like that. So it's like if you're designing an airplane, you need to make sure you have a very good understanding of the physical nature of fluid dynamics so that, wings don't fly off and doors don't fly off and whatever other fun things Boeing can provide us these days. But you have to have a mastery of these natural elements. And a lot of that is categorized as things that we would call risk. And specifically, those are, like you said, it's things that you can quantify. So the idea is that, the rate at which a certain event happens, but not necessarily, so the whole class of events, but you don't know who in particular it's going to happen to. So that there tends to be this amount of rainfall, but you don't know specifically if that will be the amount this year. You just know that, if you roll a die, that, it's 1 out of 6, but you don't know which one you're going to get. And so the more that you have an understanding of the natural element or just phenomenon that you can have some level of like an actuarial table around, once that can be sort of quantified, then you can produce insurance where you pool resources together, and you are sort of speculating when you put in money into insurance, but it's specifically dealing with, I don't know if I'm going to break my leg this year. There's just this probability. We in society, we tend to see this amount of things happening, and I have this likelihood, so I'm going to pool my resources with a speculative guess that I could be one of them, and I'm willing to put in a smaller amount just in case that happens, and they can do that. Then there's gambling, which is when you are dealing with basically a contrived game. So when you go to the casino, it's games with completely like made up rules that it's very contrived and artificial, and so you are making a purely a prediction based off kind of pre-established stuff. But finally, there's speculation, and that's getting into in the uncertainty sense, which is you literally just don't know. You don't know what things are going to happen. The world, anything could happen. I mean, even for things that are insurable, there are times where the world make something happen that the insurance itself was not ready for that, a tail event, and it collapses the whole thing. That is possible. And for all of those events, if they can't be insurable, like, you need something else. And so the answer is having the most marketable good to be able to know if it's the most marketable, that anyone anywhere is going to be desiring it. You have that expectation. But this kind of expectation, when you're kind of engaging in that kind of speculation, is you are using your understanding of other people's values to try to make a guess at what other people in the market are going to value in the future. And what we see with money is that this tends towards goods that have what you're describing as the least uncertain properties. So that if there are these cryptographic properties with the keys, those keys are going to be just fine. Obviously keys can get stolen or whatever, but given that it's sitting in an offline vault somewhere, that barring the issue of physical theft, those keys are going to remain durable. Based on the proof of work and difficulty adjustment and all of that the supply of Bitcoin and the processing of blocks is going to maintain a sort of statistically fixed rate. I guess fixed is a bit of a wrong word, but it's within a statistical range of approximately 10 minutes, which is its own kind of like durability. And basically you have more expectations that Bitcoin will be able to deliver what is on the tin at any time in any place. And if everyone has a reason to deal with future uncertainty, everyone is going to have a reason to be moving towards a good that is able to overcome those things. And so you're going to have that market demand for it. So people can read that article for a much better explanation than I just gave about these different concepts and how it relates to money. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that it's like, the question isn't, is this speculative demand for Bitcoin or not? We know it is, and like that's fine to even say so. The real question is not, is it speculative? The real question is, why are people speculating on it? And when George Selgin or others use that as a pejorative, what they're really trying to say is, I don't think that this has value at all, so I don't agree. Going back to previous articles that we've read, I don't agree with the appraisal of Bitcoin that others have. Whereas we look at what it offers, and the appraisal makes a lot of sense, especially when we consider what we've described here, which is when the purchasing power goes up, it only makes the fundamentals of Bitcoin even stronger. Something else that I wanted to talk about was that, a lot of people, when they think about spending Bitcoins, they think about that as being a sort of demand for Bitcoin. And what we see when we look at money through this lens, the demand for money as a medium of exchange deals with the desire to acquire the good rather than the readiness to part with the good because you demand something else. That's actually, to spend your Bitcoin is to choose to no longer use it. You're dishoarding, you're dishodling. And so, at least within the Austrian sphere, we talk about money as having, and I mean, basically all goods, but money being a good has the same thing, which is the demand for money is made up of exchange demand and reservation demand. And reservation demand, as we've talked, that's saving. That's just, I have a stock of Bitcoin. Am I willing to do I want to continue to hold it? If so, then you have reservation demand. You're just sitting on what you have. Exchange demand, a lot of people think of it as being like I want to go use it in payments. I want to go buy something with it. But the exchange demand is not on that side. That's sell pressure. The exchange demand is on the side of the person who's demanding to acquire Bitcoin, demanding to acquire money. So in this case, like a merchant might have exchange demand, but we don't know that they have reservation demand. And if they don't have reservation demand, then they're really just kind of adding to the broad sell pressure of Bitcoin if they're just immediately selling it and at the margin. And so the actual where exchange demand exists is for, it can be a merchant, it can be just a person going to a brokerage. It's anyone who wants to take the goods that they have and exchange it for Bitcoin. So, exchange demand is stacking sats. That is what exchange demand actually means, is stacking sats, and then reservation demand is to hodl the sats. So in that case, if you put those together and you have a long-term vision of Bitcoin, you're not only going to have exchange demand, but you're also going to have increased reserve demand. And given that, these things, especially with the expectations of Bitcoin, it's going to cause a feedback loop where both of those demands are going up. You want to exchange for more and more, and you start looking for every last chair in your house that you can get rid of so that you can increase your exchange demand for Bitcoin has increased such that you're willing to start, just selling everything for Bitcoin. And then for whatever it is that you do acquire, as reservation demand grows, that is an increased desire to hold that with a sort of speculative expectation of where Bitcoin would go. Specifically, this idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy, we've previously talked about the sort of the collective hallucination idea of money and why we think that that's misguided. But I would point out that in this case, when we talk about self-fulfilling prophecy, it's not merely that, when we say like belief in Bitcoin improves the Bitcoin network, as long as people back up the belief by the action of acquiring and holding more, that belief, at least described here, someone who has a collective hallucination view of money could take belief in that to just mean, oh yeah, like everyone kind of has just this belief in Bitcoin, and yeah, like the value's going up, so it kind of makes more and more sense to kind of latch onto it as a shelling point. But I also think that from a more, say, fitting into more of what we've described here, we could also use the term expectations to describe people's sort of, you could say rational expectations of why Bitcoin would be what it is. And finally, something that I want to point out here, because of the fact that, when we talk about the self-fulfilling prophecy, I'm actually looking, this links to an old Conrad Graf article on hypermonetization, which is sort of a precursor to hyperbitcoinization. But this was there was an old Satoshi quote about, you might want to acquire some, and it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. But something I also want to point out there is that the idea of hoarding is, in some sense, it is a kind of cypherpunk value. And I say that because there are a lot of people who they are interested in Bitcoin for the payments benefits. Now, earlier in the article, he says, how Bitcoin is so convenient to make payments with. And that is true for a lot of things. And I really do enjoy the UX of being able to spend Bitcoins, especially, lightning payments and so on. It makes, especially online payments, just so much nicer. In-person payments, there's typically, you just, tap your phone, tap your card or whatever, and things happen super fast. Online, maybe if you're using Apple Pay, you can, double click or whatever, but especially on a desktop computer, doing, buying something, there's nothing easier than just kind of, using Bitcoin to sell.
Well, and to your point, like the Apple Pay option presupposes that, on one end, there's somebody who has implemented Apple Pay, and that even if you look at like services like Cash App or Venmo, you have to have both people on it. And it's to me like the the nice part about it is how much information you do or don't have to share. And so with Bitcoin, it's just and this is something that Satoshi actually puts in the white paper that people don't really talk about enough, is the pseudonymous privacy model of Bitcoin payments. And that people trash Bitcoin's privacy because they have some kind of nirvana fallacy of, perfect privacy. But it's such a better system than inputting your credit card number or even your checking account number, where they can take as much money as they want or whatever. So I think that Bitcoin as payments continues to be underestimated, even though obviously I think that the main show is as an investment, as store value or savings.
Yes. So yeah, and I think it's just important to, like, when I'm critiquing this point of view, it's not Bitcoin as payments, because I love Bitcoin as payments. It's where the value of Bitcoin is being derived from in the market sense, is as we're describing. It's because there are hoarders who actually have a demand for it. Now, the better payments infrastructure exists, then obviously that adds into that, but all of that is reliant on the hoarders. Now, the reason I bring it up as a cypherpunk thing, so to speak, is that, I did not grab this ahead of time, so I'll just have to put a link in the show notes. But Hal Finney's original response to Bitcoin is one of how big could this thing be? Which in and of itself has this sort of expectation of, number can go up. And further, he had a breakdown at some point of looking at the number of Bitcoins that are going to exist and just a, napkin math view of how much wealth there is. And he made a long-term appraisal of Bitcoin as being worth about, $10 million in today's prices, today being many years when he stated this. This was very early on in Bitcoin. And when you speak of it's not at odds with a cypherpunk view, because the cypherpunks were wanting to, yes, they wanted private payments because of the benefits, of having private payments online. But underneath that, it's like, well, why do they want private payments? It's because we want to be able to accumulate capital and be productive people in peace. And when more of that information is out there, it can create ways in which you are beholden to other people who can get in the way of your process of peaceful exchange and capital accumulation. And so the underlying thing is, like, why do you want payments in the first place? And it's not just because we want to have the joys of sending money to one another. It's because we are trying to actually use it as a medium of exchange, which encourages a division of labor, which encourages, a greater amount of capital production and accumulation, which, then in turn allows us to have more nice things. In that sense, it's like we're all looking for number go up in terms of the quality of life, the amount of, material wealth that we can work for, not because material wealth is everything, but because it sure makes it easier to just, get through life so you can focus on higher things. And so I do not think that hoarding and a savings, Bitcoin as savings technology, is at odds with some sort of cypherpunk ethos. That being said, we say this about privacy. The biggest threat here has to do with the actual on-ramps to Bitcoin. If you are exchanging through a brokerage, which is that there aren't a lot of merchants out there who, or people wanting to spend Bitcoin on things. So there's only so much that you can expect to be able to sell to people that they'd be willing to part with sats for, except for if you show up with dollars. Because of that, the dollar system has a major privacy problem, an incredibly horrible privacy problem, an entire, decades of financial surveillance has been built up around it, thanks to the Bank Secrecy Act and such. And so it's more of a, it's a fiat problem more than it is a Bitcoin problem.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's like to the point of the article, if you want more people using this privacy technology, as imperfect as it is, of the pseudonymous addresses, and even, of Lightning Network, right, having better privacy properties, the Bitcoin price has to go up, right? The reservation demand has to increase, and that gets to the heart of it.
Yes. And, when you accept Bitcoin, you don't have to, at least as of now, and hopefully this will continue, you are not under expectations of doing KYC. And so actually anything, when you are able to sell something for Bitcoin, you can get some non-KYC coins, and that's a wonderful thing. However, yes, if you have to deal with the reality of how we expect Bitcoin to grow, which is based on, the real economic value, which is coming from hoarding, and the real expectations that, people are just not going to want to give up their sats so easily. With that, you have to wait. You have to be patient and do what you can to help grow the reservation demand so that we can get to that point that people are finally ready to give up more sats, and that you have gotten to a point where you are capable of producing things that people demand more than their sats or their sats, future value. And all of this works together. This is not that these are not mutually exclusive things. It's all part of the monetization process in general. And so we just have to take it in stride the way that it actually works, rather than trying to artificially make it work against people's economic interests. So with all that, let's round out this article. All hail the hoarders. Let out your inner hoarder. Don't deny your urges. Let him come out and come to terms with him. Imagine how he would look if he could sit on your hoard of Bitcoins. Doesn't he look terribly happy? Let him roll in your Bitcoins. Doesn't he look so cute poring over his copy of Atlas Shrugged? Look at how gleeful he is as he buries it in his basement. Now let his avariciousness flow over you. It's a tough word. Let it seep under your skin. Let your hands clutch. Let your teeth clench and your mouth contort into a covetous grimace. I want to hear cackles. Now, didn't that feel good? The Bitcoin economy will thank you in the end. So obviously this is taking a tongue-in-cheek perspective, but I think it's doing that on a very important point, and something that really is beautiful about the free market in general, which is the way to win in a free market that is one that is based on a sound rule of law, based on actual property rights and liberty and so on and so forth. The way that you succeed is by having correct expectations of other people's value. That is, you have to actually be tuned in to what others want. And so even the most greedy person who all they want to do is do what they can to acquire Bitcoin in a law-abiding manner, and just sit on it like the worst of the misers. Even that activity is one that is sort of sublimated by the market process into something that brings goodness to everyone in the marketplace. And there is something really, really beautiful about that fact that, as long as you can maintain law and order, which is obviously a big ask for governments today, but when you're able to do that, even these, what seem like a bad thing, it's actually doing wonders for other people. And so we don't have to be upset when there is a greedy person. Maybe there's something about their soul that we need to be, concerned about and, pray for, or whatever it might be, to and or even just avoid that behavior for ourselves. But in terms of its effects on others, it actually could still be sort of sublimated into a positive for the rest of the economy. And Bitcoin hoarding has always been, or money hoarding is treated as one of these things. One of these things that's just this, we just imagine the miserly, like we said, Scrooge McDuck or Ebenezer Scrooge, or any of these other characters. It's just the fat cat sitting on his money. And, I think this helps us see how maybe there's certain ways that you shouldn't want to do it in your own life, but the actual process of hoarding on, the sitting on the money, is not the bad thing. And we should actually be sort of thankful for it, insofar as it makes Bitcoin more useful and more valuable for the rest of the world, and gives them more chances for economic freedom. Pierre, do you have anything else to add on this before we wrap up?
No, great article.
Yes, so I hope everyone enjoyed that. Like I said, I think this is, I think this article in particular is among the pantheon of great Bitcoin articles, and has really stood the test of time. So glad we finally got to read it, and the implications of this are huge, and a lot of the rest of the mempool, has a lot that's building on what is implied by the sort of virtues, so to speak, of Bitcoin hoarding. So thank you for joining me, and thank you for listening to The Reorg. This podcast is brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, dedicated to advancing and preserving Bitcoin knowledge. Our mission is to deepen understanding and appreciation of Bitcoin, not just for today, but for generations to come, by creating enduring educational resources and generational knowledge for generational wealth. If you enjoyed the show, please support our work by sharing links, deepening your own Bitcoin knowledge by exploring and studying the SNI archives, and contributing sats. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely entirely on supporters like you. Whether you can give a few Satoshis or a few thousand Bitcoins, your contributions enable us to continue educating current and future Bitcoiners worldwide.